Let's welcome Rabbi Yehuda Stern, Rabbi of Sydenham Shul, for our keynote address this evening. Stay tuned afterwards for a special video presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Kievman, and thank you to Chabad House for inviting me to be part of this Farbrengen tonight. A good Tavach to all those who have joined us. And it's a special time, as was mentioned, to gather together and to reflect and to connect all of us together in honor of this day of Gimmel Tammuz, the Yahrzeit of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as well as the 40th anniversary of the conclusion of the Rambam. There was once a chassid, a pious man and his family, who lived in Russia during World War II. He lived there with mesiras nefesh, self-sacrifice, devoting his life to the service of God, davening, praying, learning, educating his children under very compromised circumstances. He was drafted into the Russian army, and he fought his utmost to keep Shabbos properly, to keep kashrut, the laws of kosher, properly. How difficult it was under these compromising circumstances that they lived in Russia at that time. He and his family eventually managed to leave Russia, and they traveled to France. It was then 1947 when the Rebbe visited France, when he came to bring his mother, to collect her, to bring her to New York. At that point, the Rebbe wasn't Rebbe just yet. He was called the Ramash, which was an acronym that stood for his name, the Menachem Mendel Schneerson. This particular chassid, this particular man, had the privilege of sitting at the Rebbe's small and intimate Farbrengen there in France. It was only a few years later that his family, together with his wife and children, they managed to move to Melbourne, Australia, where together with a small group of families, they established a beautiful Jewish community as Melbourne has today, with shuls and schools, kashrut, and Jewish infrastructure, etc. This man, this chassid, his name was Rabbi Nachum Zalman Gurevich. And I could go on and on about his life because I'm his great-grandson. Rabbi Nachum Zalman, my Zayda, was a role model for me of what a real chassid looks like. I grew up in a very different upbringing. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in Melbourne, Australia, in a very different lifestyle to what my Zayda and my Baba were used to. We didn't have to go to the mikveh in freezing cold rivers. We didn't have to worry about keeping Shabbos or kashrus under war, under battle in Russia at that time. What were we worried about? Well, to be honest, in those days, I was worried about which football team won their game over the weekend. That was our worries. While I had the zchus and the privilege of visiting the Rebbe for dollars and for Farbrengen, when I was 9 years old, I managed to be there in New York in 770 for 2 Sundays to receive $1 on those 2 Sundays of dollars, and to be at the Farbrengen on the Shabbos in between in the month of Teves, 1990. But nonetheless, I often ask myself the question, how was I so touched by the Rebbe and the Rebbe's teachings? I didn't grow up in an environment of mesiras nefesh, of self-sacrifice, where this is all I knew about, dedicating my life to surviving and to observing and to connecting to the Jewish way of life, inspired by the Rebbe. I also didn't grow up in Crown Heights, in the Rebbe's shchuna, in the Rebbe's neighborhood. I didn't have regular correspondence with the Rebbe. I was only 13 years old when the Rebbe passed on the 4th of Tammuz, Tafshin Nun Daled, 1994. And yet, I grew up in my teenage years knowing who I was and what my purpose was. I knew that I wanted to make a difference. in the world, as the Rebbe asked of his students, of his disciples. I knew that I wanted to be a student, a chassid of the Rebbe. But how did the Rebbe accomplish that? How did the Rebbe manage to inspire someone like myself, far and distant geographically from his Farbrengen table, and create a young person to be dedicated and want to fulfill the Rebbe's vision in making this world a better place? We are now 27 years after Gimmel Tammuz, the Rebbe's passing, and his impact in the world hasn't decreased since then. But on the contrary, there are more Chabad houses today around the world since then. There are more shluchim today. People are dedicated, following the words of the Rebbe and his teachings, whether it's regarding Israel, whether it's regarding pandemics, as was spread around his teachings last year at the break of COVID. No matter what the crisis or the celebration may be, people tap in. What did the Rebbe say about this? What would the Rebbe say about this? The Rebbe's influence is spreading wide and far, 27 years after Gimmel Tammuz. And the question is, what is the secret? What did the Rebbe have in mind? How did the Rebbe accomplish this? Last week, we read about the story of the spies entering into Israel. It's the famous tragedy of the Meraglim, the spies of Moshe Rabbeinu, appointing for himself spies to go in to see whether we are ready, the nation is ready to conquer the land. And we know how it ended in devastation. Moshe trusted these men, 12 men who were appointed, Roshei Yisrael, the leaders of Klal Yisrael, and they totally turned their back. Instead of encouraging the nation to go in, they came back with reports of scare and fear of the nation. How could we possibly go in? And the nation then broke out with moans and groans, and they were accusing Moshe Rabbeinu of wanting to kill them. What was wrong in staying back in Egypt? At the same time, last week, after reading the story of the spies in the Torah, we also read the Haftarah. And the Haftarah there speaks about Joshua, Yehoshua. And Yehoshua, who was one of the original 12 spies, who remained righteous and loyal and devoted to Moshe, together with his friend and his colleague, Kalev, 40 years later, we read about the story of Yehoshua preparing the nation to go into Israel and to conquer the land. And what does Yehoshua do? Yehoshua does the same thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did. He appointed for himself spies, not 12 this time, but rather Joshua appointed 2 spies to go into the land, to spy the land, and to see whether it was ready, whether the time was right to conquer the land. And one can ask the obvious question, what was Yehoshua thinking to appoint spies? Surely you know or you remember what happened 40 years earlier. Surely you remember what happened with Moshe Rabbeinu, who appointed for himself spies, and how that tragically ended. And now Yehoshua is getting ready to go into the land, and what does he do? He appoints spies all over again. Meraglim. Has he not learned his lesson? Does he not know that it didn't go as planned last time? Did he not learn anything from Moshe Rabbeinu and the mistake of the Jewish people? And I learned a powerful lesson, a powerful teaching that explains what the difference between the Meraglim, the spies of Moshe was, and the Meraglim, the spies of Yehoshua, and why there's a major difference. The difference was in the Meraglim, in the spies themselves. You see, Moshe looked for the Chasheva people. Moshe Rabbeinu looked for the important leaders of the Jewish people. In fact, the Torah names them. In the beginning of Parsha Shlach, last week's Torah portion, the Torah names exactly who were the spies from every tribe that was selected. These weren't just simple people. These were chasheva, important people with kavod and dignity. As the verse says, kulam anoshim, they were all upstanding individuals. The verse says, Rashi b'nei Yisrael, they were the leaders of the Jewish people. Rashi adds on more beautiful adjectives to describe them. Chashivut, Rashi says, they were chashuv, they were important. Kesherim, they were kosher, but not just kosher, they were men of high caliber. Moshe chose for himself chashuv a mention, chashuv a people, important people to do this job. Why? Because he needed to convince the nation. He needed to convince the people. He needed a group of people that would have gravitas, that would have influence, so that they would come out after spying the land and convince the people, now we are ready. And so he chose people who have their names, who have their tags, who have their emblems, who have their logos. These were top officers of the Jewish people who would go in now and come out and influence the people. But that was exactly the problem and what led to the tragedy. You see, when you choose people of such high caliber, they also have many opinions. This person has that daya, that view. This person has this daya and that view. Whether you choose a minister of finance, a minister of security, a minister of defense, each one has their views. So Moshe, on the one hand, he wanted men of gravitas, men of chashivut, of importance, Roshei B'nai Yisrael, the leaders of the people, to convince the nation that they were ready to go in. At the same time, each one had their view. Each one had their opinion. And that's what led to the tragedy. You see, Yehoshua did not need to do that. He did not need to convince the nation. The nation were ready. Yehoshua just needed to see whether the time was right. And therefore, Yehoshua did very different to Moshe. He didn't choose people who carried titles or names or prestige. It wasn't about their titles. It wasn't about their positions. It wasn't about their experience or their exposure or their importance. For Yehoshua Joshua said, I've got to do the job, and that's why I'm choosing these spies. And in fact, the Haftarah doesn't even tell us who these two people were. There's no descriptions about them. We don't flatter them. We don't praise them. We don't compliment them. We don't even know who they are. We are taught by our sages there was Kalev and Pinchas, but in the words of the Haftarah, their names are missing. Why? Because it wasn't about their titles. It wasn't about what role they played in society, in the community. There was a job that needed to be done. That was their focus. And this is exactly why Yehoshua's job succeeded. Moshe focused on people that carry titles, carry importance. Yehoshua focused on the job that needed to be done. One of the things that Kalev did when he entered the land of Israel on the original trip of the spies, because he was one of the 12 spies by Moshe Rabbeinu, Kalev went to prostrate himself in Hebron by Marat HaMachpelah, the grave of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And he bent down on the ground and he prostrated himself on the ground. And the Rebbe asks the question, why must we prostrate ourselves on the ground? Why couldn't Kalev bow down or bend down without hitting the ground, the eretz, the land? And the Rebbe answers and he says, because Kalev felt that he was important, he needed to connect the head and the feet. When you prostrate yourself on the ground, you're literally level. The head and the feet are in sync. You see, the head has its own thinking, but it's not the head that necessarily gets the job done. It's the feet that gets the job done. And we as soldiers need to remember what the job is and how we need to accomplish that job. And by prostrating himself on the ground and leveling out his head with his feet, Kalev was emphasizing the importance of how we are all equal. It's not about the chachma, the seichel, the wisdom, the leaders, the dignitaries, the politicians, but it's all equal. The head and the feet, as they prostrate themselves on the ground, are equal because the job is the most important. That's what's most important. That's what needs to be done and needs to be accomplished. And that was the focus of Yehoshua, of Joshua and his spies, not about their titles, not about their names, not about their positions, but about the job that needs to get done. I mentioned my Elter Zayda, my great-grandfather, Rabbi Nochem Zalman Gurevich. He had a brother, Beryl Gurevich, who also went through a difficult time in Russia. And the story is told about Reb Beryl that he was sent by the Russians to a camp. It was okay. It was bearable. He had food as he needed. He had his tefillin and his siddur with him. He was able to live a life where he was able to practice Yiddishkeit and Judaism with his tefillin every day and daveners every day. One of the jobs that they made the workers do there in the camp was they would make these wallets, and they would physically make them. And then it was sent out to the whole of Russia to be sold around the country. And that was his job. He was responsible for the machine that would make these wallets. One Shabbos, he was sent to work. He sat down at his machine, ready to make these wallets that they were making. He had a foot pedal that would put his foot down to move the machine, but his foot wouldn't move. It was Shabbos. How could he? The officer in charge passes by and he says, "No, Beryl, start working." Beryl can't work. Then he thinks to himself, well, maybe I should. If I work, I'll be able to stay here in the camp and I'll be able to fulfill Yiddishkeit and daven and learn as I wish to do. If I start playing games with them and I don't do as they ask of me, they're going to send me to Siberia. There I'm not going to have a siddur. There I won't have my tefillin. What am I supposed to do? But he still can't do it. He still can't put his foot down and get to work. And the officer passing by sees that he's not working. The officer tells him, "You're going to be called to court." And he gives him a date when I want to see you in court to discuss your work. Beryl Gurevich arrives to court. There he's in front of the officers, the judges, who are going to discuss his work ethic. What is happening? Why aren't you working? Why didn't you work on that particular day? And he says, "Officer, it was my Shabbos. How could I work?" And they warned him, "If you don't continue to work, we're going to send you to Siberia. What do you think you're doing? Playing games here?" He says, "I'm sorry. I can't do it. It's Shabbos." And they're furious. And they throw him out of the courtroom and they say, "Wait for us outside while we discuss this inside together." He stays outside for over an hour and they finally call him back in. And they said to him, "Beryl, from next Shabbos, we're changing your job. From next Shabbos, you will stand and guard the room that controls the lights of the camp." He can't believe this. They're changing his job. They won't make him work on Shabbos. He's going to be put to guard the warehouse, the room that controls the lights. He says to them, "No punishment, no sentence." And listen to what they tell him. "Whoever else we put as a guard of this room has stolen from us. Any guard we put at the room has stolen the lights from the room, the bulbs, the lights. But you are so devoted to your task, to your mission, to your job, you're even willing to give your life for the observance of Shabbos. You have your values set. You are clear on what's important to you, and someone like you that we can trust that you won't steal from here. This will be good for both you and for us." You see, my friends, the Rebbe was not looking for the holiest of people to do his work of spreading Yiddishkeit. He wasn't looking for the greatest of his Hasidim, the Chashavah people, Roshei B'nai Yisrael, the leaders of the Jewish people. Those who come with that approach or this approach, this opinion or that opinion, this concern or that concern. The Rebbe was looking to accomplish a job. The job was to prepare this world for Mashiach, to transform this world into a place of kindness, of the spiritual over the physical. He was looking for foot soldiers who know the right from wrong, who are willing to do the job and make sure that the job is done. In the Rebbe's eyes, the scientist and the shoemaker are equal in the mission of God. Whether you work with the greatest academics or whether you work on fixing shoes, both of you carry a role and a mission in transforming this world into a world of divine revelation and Torah. And so for me, this answers my question. This is how the Rebbe touched a young boy in Melbourne, Australia. Because in the Rebbe's eyes, that young boy was as important as the chassid sitting at the Farbrengen, whether in France or New York. That message came through to me and to so many others like me. This is the message that has pulled me along throughout my journey of life. Whether you were alive when the Rebbe was alive physically or not, whether you lived in Crown Heights or not, whether you are a rabbi or rebbitzin or not, whether you have a beard or not, whether you have a sheitel or not, the Rebbe wants us all to assist him in his shlichus, in his mission, and to ensure that the job gets done. We must do our bit to better this world, and maybe with our family members, encouraging them to come along with us, or in our work environment, in our offices, or with our friends. We've all got contacts. We've all got friends. We're all online tonight receiving the inspiration of the Rebbe, and to take this, we can't be shy. Don't think too much about it. A little, yes, but not too much. Like Joshua's spies, like Yeshua's spies. We have a job to do. That's what the Rebbe wants of us. Just a story to illustrate this point, which recently happened, and some of you may have read it, but nonetheless, it really struck me. In 2016, Rabbi Uriel Vigler, who many of you know, my brother-in-law, took a flight from New York to Israel. On the plane, he carried his tefillin, and there he bumped into two Israelis who were returning from New York, Yosef and Elad. As the Rebbe taught, you can't waste your time. You're there for a mission. You're there for a purpose. You're there for a job. Uriel approaches these two secular-looking Israelis, Yosef and Elad, and asks them to put on tefillin. They were not too fazed, and they agreed quite happily. They rolled up their sleeves, and Uriel helped them put on tefillin. But listen to this. That story came and went very quickly. It's now 5 years later, 2021. And just 2 weeks ago, Yosef put out a Facebook message with a picture of him on that plane 5 years earlier with his friend Elad and this Chabad rabbi. And he said, I'm looking to get hold of this individual. And he shared that picture and he said, if anybody knows who this is, please do put us in touch with each other. Well, Jewish geography works quite quickly. And in a very short time, Rabbi Uriel Vigler is contacted. He's the contact. He can't believe this. He communicates with Yosef and he says, what's up? Why are you looking for me? And Yosef says as follows, after feeling so low and so removed from spirituality during our time in New York, something on that flight back to Israel clicked. That moment of tefillin hit us. It was like fire in our souls were ignited. As we came back to Israel, we started searching, started looking for some more meaning. We found Rabbi Manis Friedman's classes on YouTube. We started listening to him. We recently joined Rabbi Adi Elephant's teaching classes in Israel and Tel Aviv, and we become more and more dedicated and devoted to Torah learning and Judaism. Today, Yosef writes, he's learning Torah every day. He's keeping Shabbos and kosher, putting on tefillin, and teaching a Tanya class of his own. And we looked out to find who was the person that ignited that flame within us. Many will say that's the power of one mitzvah, right? One mitzvah ignites the flame. Putting on tefillin ignited their flame. Well, friends, tonight I say, this is the power of one person. A simple person on a plane, meeting two individuals, offering them to put on tefillin. That's what ignites a flame. You don't have to be some great person. Rabbi Uriel is a great person, but you don't have to be a great person like him. Anyone to do that could really change a person's life just by meeting an individual and igniting their flame and starting them to teach and to spread and to fulfill the Rebbe's mission and his shlichus to this world. And I think we see this as my final idea for tonight in the Rambam's learning cycle. How the Rebbe spread the teachings of the Rambam Maimonides and asked us each to learn. But it wasn't just a mission statement for Torah scholars. It wasn't just a mission statement for those academics who are able to study the words of Maimonides, the words of the Rambam. The Rebbe came up with a plan that makes each person, men, women, and children, relevant to the Rambam's learning cycle. And he gave 3 cycles, as has been illustrated before, whether it's learning 3 chapters a day, whether it's learning 1 chapter a day, or whether it's learning Sefer HaMitzvot, the list of the commandments, which is a short paragraph every day. The Rebbe is telling us all, we're all equal in this. Academic or shoemaker, we're all equal in this, to fulfill the role of spreading Torah and transforming this world. What really blew me away last year was the launch of WhatsApp groups that we established around the country to help spread the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the daily mitzvahs of the Rambam. It was mentioned before about the 1 chapter a day Zoom class every day. But in addition to that, we also created, many of the rabbis created WhatsApp groups, spreading a 2-minute short piece of the daily Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam, making a person who's traveling to work, who's in their car, being able to tap into this. Because as we said, everyone's equal in the mission of the Rebbe, in the job to learn more Torah, spread more Judaism, and light up this world. So as we commemorate today the 27th yard site, it's a time to reflect. It's a time to recharge. It's a time to think about the mission that the Rebbe set for the world of preparing the world for Mashiach, a time of peace, of tranquility, of health, of safety, and he empowered each one of us. It's not about titles, it's not about names, it's not about experience. We can all do the job. Hamaiseh hu ha'ikar. The main thing is for us is to get the job done, like the spies, like the Meraglim of Yehoshua, of Joshua. Please God, we utilize this time productively and we fulfill our mission and our task. And may we be zoche, may we merit to the coming of Mashiach, who will lead us to Yerushalayim with the Rebbe at our head. May it happen speedily.